Hey everyone, here we are with the last video for Unit 5. We're looking at political forces and processes. So far we've looked at political entities and structures from federal states to unitary states to the concept of nations and states to begin with and how the political map has changed over time. And we looked at boundaries and borders and the disputes that happened thereafter, especially as related to the law of the sea. Here we're looking at the upshot of all of these, right? We've looked at all the bits and pieces. Here we're looking at the forces behind some of these issues, as well as the processes that can take place between states or within states. Let's get started. So we have two sets of forces that we're concerned with most when we're talking about political forces and political geo. That's one of the sides we're looking at is what we call a centripetal force, the other side being a centrifugal force or centrifugal force, depending on how you say it. The centripetal forces are any forces that, like we look at, are going to create unity or strengthen the unity of a state or to help maintain that state's unity itself. A centrifugal force, on the other hand, is going to contribute to the breaking up of a state or the prevention of a state from forming in the first place. We're not thinking of push and pull factors, those are different. That's migration patterns or reasons for migration to and from a particular area. These are not quite the same. This is about maintaining state unity, right? All happy together all at once. Now, we have different forces that act as centripetal forces, centrifugal forces, but these are really two sides of the same coin. So we're going to look at some examples, and we'll be able to see how the example could fit a centripetal force, or if we don't have that example on hand, how its opposite could fit a centripetal force or centrifugal force, vice versa. Now here we have a number of maps, different examples, and here we're looking at Nigeria, and we're looking at religious distribution in this case. And we can see these markings. We have Christians, Muslims, and others as the majority in these areas, as well as areas that have Sharia or non-Sharia law. Now, with Christians and Muslims, we see a pretty mixed bag in some of these areas along this border. But for the most part, we can see that in the northernmost and in the southernmost parts of Nigeria, we have very distinct cultural identities, at least in regard to religion. In the northernmost part of Nigeria, we have a large Muslim population. In the southernmost part, we have a majority Christian population. That itself, this difference, distinction between culture groups can act as a centrifugal force. Can lead to conflict within a state, and conflict within a state is something part and parcel with the breakup of a state. Now, Nigeria hasn't broken up. It's still together. It's one piece. But there were other issues that had to take place, especially in regard to urban profile, to the urban profile of Nigeria, especially in regard to the capital city or the primate city, as we had it here, right? Primate city is the Unit 7 stuff we didn't get to go through. It's a city that's at least twice as large as the next largest city. And in this case, we had one capital in the south, which was a source of conflict because that's the majority Christian south. But we have two distinct majority cultures in Nigeria, Muslims and Christians. And so there was an air of unfairness because of this, right? Because lots of resources, when you have a primate city with a super large area, jobs, economic power, political power, social power, and influence are all concentrated in that one largest city. And if you have it in one end of the country versus the other, especially in a country like Nigeria, where you have a very distinct profile culturally for each of these ends of the country, that can lead to conflict, or at least could be a source of conflict between those two cultures. And it was in this case. So the capital was moved. It was a forward capital, as we call it, to the center of Nigeria, as opposed to being in the south, strictly in the south. But that's one way that we can see centrifugal forces play out. We have two different cultures, or more than two different cultures, who may have some sort of conflict or disagreement between them, and that can be a source of conflict between those cultures, as we said, which itself can lead to or contribute to, disunity in a state, and that state possibly not sticking together. If we have a state that's looking to be formed, or maybe a cultural group that's looking to establish itself. Maybe it's within a state that has a separate identity and majority identity, and that's going to also create a conflict there because that state doesn't want to lose any part of its territory, and this culture group wants to have its own territory, even though there's not necessarily empty space, right? We don't have a lot of empty space anymore. Someone has some sort of control over most habitable areas, throughout the world. Then we have issues like Indonesia, where we're looking at the morphology of a state, the shapes of states, and how they're formed. And Indonesia is, as you can tell, split apart. It's what we call fragmented. It's fragmented state. And with these fragmented states, we're looking at the separation between each piece of the state, because this is one entire sovereign state. It has the same borders in between. But it's physically separated from one island to the next, to the next, to the next, and all these others in between. The issue there is that it's just difficult for one specific government to find itself with even influence, given that the state itself is split apart. So that physical separation can lead to more independence, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But that independence could also mean that these specific groups that are on these different islands may feel entitled to more sovereignty, or feel that they want more sovereignty to begin with, because they are separate, because they may develop distinct cultures unto themselves, and that may not fit with the majority culture that was originally established in the area, because over time, as you're separated, those cultures diverge more and more. So this fragmentation can also serve as a centrifugal force. We have a state altogether, especially a small state that's very close together, like a compact state, right, roughly circular, or at least even distribution from the center to the, or even distance from the center of the state to the edges, especially in a small area. That's a lot easier to maintain, to keep unified, than a state like we have here with Indonesia that is physically separated into all these pieces. The last issues that we see are between, similar to the first example with religion, cultural identities in general. So we see, excuse me, in Sri Lanka and in what was the former Yugoslavia, a variety of different cultures. Now, we have some differences here, and we're going to touch on that with Sri Lanka first, where we have one majority culture, which are the Sinhalese, right? We have the Sinhalese, which majority are, again, we're looking at ethnic identities, so the Sinhalese majority who are Buddhist, who speak their own separate language from Tamil. When we have Sri Lankan Tamils, we have Indian Tamils, but we have the Sinhalese who are Buddhists, who are the majority group in this, right? We can see all the Sinhalese in these areas. And then we have all these mixtures of other groups. Now, when we have a super majority like this, we have this one major majority religion or ethnic group. That group more than likely is going to have most, if not all, the power in that state. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't lead to centrifugal forces on its own, but it can act as a centrifugal force if that majority is not taking into account the other ethnicities or religions that are also in that same state. So if we think about food taboos, right? Food restrictions in certain religions. With Judaism, with Islam, we have a shared restriction on pork consumption. Now, Buddhists may not have that same restriction. There are a variety of different Buddhists. We can have vegetarian Buddhists, we can have non-vegetarian Buddhists, and pescatarian everywhere in between. But if those laws or policies maybe don't reflect that, that can also be seen as imposing. That can cause conflict within the state too, right? If laws and policies are made or created by one ethnic group, they're going to fit that ethnic group more than the other ones that are present in the state. And if you have a supermajority, if you have a supermajority like the one we have here, that can be more difficult to parse because the original groups, which may have been the Sinhalese in this case, right, are going to be used to that sort of control. And unless we have representation from these other smaller groups, the laws and policies may not be shared in the sense that the representation is shared for each of the groups present in Sri Lanka. And we've seen issues in Sri Lanka. We are seeing issues in Sri Lanka with the Tamils and the Sinhalese Buddhists, where we have conflict that's occurring due to ethnic tensions in the area. Now, Yugoslavia isn't quite the same. Right? We don't have the supermajority that we're looking at. But we are looking at a mix of ethnic identities. Right? We have these, what was a multinational state and what have become multinational states in certain cases, right? Because all of this boundary and border here was Yugoslavia. And then we have these splits that happen into 2015 where we have new independent states that are present. Now, for the most part, we end up seeing nation states form. So like here with Slovenia, with Croatia, with Serbia, we can see that they have one majority ethnic group. That's going to fit into our nation state idea. But some of these other states, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, have much more diverse groupings of people. And we can see later on that this also leads to other conflicts that happened thereafter, right? So in 1990, when the um, Yugoslavian wars start, we see a lot of these groupings go into conflict because naturally we have lots of groups that are fighting for their own independent sovereign states. We have the self-determination that's happening with these groups. After the fact, even up into 2015, we can still see some conflict in these areas, and into the late 1990s we see conflict because we still have conflict going on within some of these states, right? Because we still have multiple ethnic groups who are also wanting to find their own independent spaces. So we can look at culture in general, religion, identity, language, etc., and it can act either as a centripetal force or a centrifugal force. Right, so we can see again two sides of the same coin. If we have a multitude of ethnicities, especially if they have a history of self-determination, that can act as a centrifugal force and can create disunity within a state and cause a state to break apart at the worst, like happened in Yugoslavia. Or if we have a single identity, if we think of a nation state, right, one single majority culture, that can act as a unifier because the majority of people, if not everyone in that one particular country, everyone being the ones who are native to the country, um, not necessarily indigenous to the country, but native to it, whether at its time of creation or after the fact, share that history and identity. And so the laws and policies fit everybody there, and most everyone agrees uh, on these different cultural divides between religion, language, ethnicity, etc. Again, as was said twice already, right? Two sides of the same coin. If we have a single majority culture, that can act as a centripetal force, right? Unifying that state because we have this one shared culture, cultural identity between the people in that state. If we have a multitude of those cultures, potentially it could lead to conflict. It's not going to happen all the time, but that is a potential source for centrifugal forces. Now, these forces themselves, centripetal, especially centrifugal, because that's where we see the after effects, right, are going to result in a lot of cases challenges to sovereignty. These issues between states and how they maintain their sovereignty. And really, what that means is we're looking at the national level, how well that national government is able to maintain its sovereign power, right, free from outside control, but also free from internal differences. So we look at processes like devolution. I have this graphic here. Now, devolution is the sharing or distribution of power from a national government to sub-governments or sub-governmental units. So we have here the United Kingdom as an example. This would be our parliament, right, Westminster Parliament, which is the national government for the United Kingdom. And it distributes powers to the subunits, right, the other countries, Scotland, Wales, etc. They have ultimate authority. Whatever laws and policies are going to be passed, they have ultimate authority to decide what or what's not happen. Now, that being said, there are shared powers that can be distributed to sub-government units like provinces, states, etc., just to make governmental practices easier. So schooling, healthcare, schooling, education, right? Housing and taxes. Those are usually the powers that we see distributed when we see devolution, where these subunits, and here in the US, you can think of it like the states, but we can also think of it like the cities, the towns, municipalities, and counties have the ability to create certain laws for themselves. And they don't need government approval to do that. And you can see this in Brussels, especially in places where we have potential for centrifugal forces. So we think about communities surrounding Brussels. In Belgium, we have lots of complications in Belgium because it's a very much a multinational state unto itself. And so we have these different political units that have different powers within that one single state. So there's still a national government that has large scale control over national economic policies, military policies, etc. But each of these subunits that we can see here can create laws about language that's being used, official languages for that particular district, schooling, taxes, healthcare, etc. Those, excuse me, are left up to these areas. Those powers are devolved from the national government. In other cases, like in Canada, we can see powers given for, yes, control reasons, because we want to make sure that we have representation of identities, but also as a sort of restitution. Um, and not quite like a reparation, like we may have heard of in the news and things like that. But we're looking at institutions that have been put in place to represent largely marginalized groups, like American Indians in this case in North America, with those indigenous living in Nunavut, or those of indigenous descent living in Nunavut in Canada. And so we have, again, schooling, healthcare, education that are given to these groups, to the indigenous groups that still live in this area in Canada. One, to represent their own individual sovereignty, not national sovereignty, because they're still under this umbrella of the Canadian national government. But for the most part, they have this kind of semi-independence where they can create local laws for themselves that fit their own particular ethnic identities and that are according to historical representations of that ethnic identity. Outside of these areas, we have Spain, a classic example, one that's been in CNN 10 for the last couple of years pretty consistently. And this one particular region, Catalonia, which has been fighting and fighting and fighting for its own independence over the years. Now we see devolution happen here for a separate reason. All right, Catalonia is a very wealthy region of Spain and has a lot of economic output. And the issue that we see is that as powers devolve, it may give credence to larger independence movements. Catalonia itself has a unique historical identity that's separate from traditional Spaniards, a unique culture, language, shared history that is separate from the rest of the country, and that lends itself to self-determination. This group that wants to have its own independent state that fully represents its cultural identity and other outputs, powers, etc. So while devolution itself is just about sharing this power, which can act as a centripetal force, we usually see this act as a centrifugal force instead. We see it lead to potential disunity within a state, if nothing else, because it's giving more power to specific groups within a state. Now, that's not to say that those groups are going to run away with that power, that they're going to use that to create an independence movement and separate from the larger state itself, but the potential is there. And that's really what we mean by centrifugal force. It doesn't matter that it's happening or that it's happened in a particular country, but if it's likely to happen, or if it's part of the set of causes that could lead to unity or breakup of a state, then we're going to put it into one of these categories of centripetal forces. And devolution could definitely be one of these centrifugal forces. If we think back to Nigeria and the Christian North and the Muslim North and the Christian South, that itself, those differences between religious identities to the extreme, that we have one half of the country that's majority one religion, the other half that's majority another religion, that itself is a centrifugal force. And part of that devolution has happened for these groups to make their own laws, right? Like instituting Sharia law in the northern part of Nigeria and not having those same laws in the southern part of Nigeria can also, again, be results of devolution because those governments can make those choices for themselves, but it can also act as a centrifugal force that can lead to conflict within the country or the separation of a country, the breakup of a state at the worst. Now, outside of these forces, we see differences in devolution in federal states versus unitary states. Now, federal states we talked about as having these sub-government units, and these are distinct sub-government units with shared power. So devolution is kind of built into federal states, whether they're using a constitution or otherwise, because these separate units are going to be able to make their local laws or regional laws for themselves. This usually means that we can distribute power more easily because the systems have already been established to accept or distribute that power. It also means that we may have more representation for people in marginalized areas because we're going to have areas that have, again, more local control due to this devolution that's occurred and are able to take more efficient action. So if we have, let's say, some kind of disaster that happens throughout, in this case, Germany is the example we're looking at, some kind of economic disaster, and the government institutes a plan, each of these sub-governments can institute that plan on their own. After direction by the national government, of course, in that scenario. And they're going to be able to fulfill those requirements more easily because they already have some established powers to do so. So we can see these differences play out that way, right, as a result of this already built-in system in federal states. Now, in unitary states, we don't see quite the same thing. Again, a unitary state has power in one central or national government or in one geographic place. And what that means is that when we devolve powers, we may have we don't have as many built-in systems to do that. So we have this one national government, but we don't really have any established sub-government units that can distribute those powers or that can take hold of those devolved powers themselves. It's going to be slower to roll out some of these initiatives, right? If we have a new government power or policy that's going to happen, because we don't already have those systems in place, like with a federal state, which have these local or regional governments already built into the system. And so we can see the evolution play out differently in those cases, in the federal state versus the unitary state. Now, the large scale differences that we see now, and this other threat to sovereignty, let's say that, but I digress. Supranationalism is this separate process where we have two or more sovereign states working together to achieve some common goal or purpose, for some common purpose. Now, we have different examples of supranational organizations like the European Union, like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and where they're going to have different purposes therein. For NATO, it's about military protections or action, right, preparing for any potential threats in the future. The European Union is mainly economic in purpose, to promote economic integration, to support free trade, as well as to create this open border system to make, again, trade as easy as possible, to make economic integration as easy as possible. Now, the issue and the threat that we have to sovereignty, or the challenge to sovereignty rather, instead of a threat, that's a little too negative, is the fact that these supranational organizations have overarching reach. Because there are multiple states that are working together, none of these states, once joining some of these supranational organizations, are going to have complete sovereignty over what they do within that organization. They're going to have to adhere to these new sets of rules. So if we have these groups in the European Union, and they're going to create laws, right? The European Union itself and its members, its leaders, what have you, are going to create laws and policies that may not be to the agreement of certain states within the Union. Now, those states, by being members of this supranational organization, are not going to be able to independently complete their own tasks, or they're not going to be able to complete tasks to their own ends, right? Because they're going to be at, not the mercy, but they're going to be challenged by this overarching power of the supranational organization. Same thing with NATO. Unless you pull out of that organization, you're not going to have the ability to take sovereign steps as a country usually would, as a state usually would, by virtue of being a member of this larger organization. And the organization itself and what other members agree to may not be what every country agrees to for a certain policy or a certain practice. But by being a member of this organization, you're not able to fully commit to your own independent ends. And some of you who have been in different clubs, organizations, or sports, you can think of sports this way too. If you're playing an independent sport like singles tennis, every decision is your own decision, right? You're independent of anyone else. If you are in a doubles situation, or if you're on anything that requires a team like basketball or football or soccer, what have you, you cannot just go off on your own and start making independent decisions, sovereign decisions, right, for yourself, because there's an entire team dynamic that's at play. And what the team may want to do overall may not be what you want to do. And you don't have necessarily the power to change that, right? And so we have the challenge to sovereignty that happens through these supranational organizations. And we have different organizations in the world. NATO, which we looked at, which has a military purpose in terms of defense. The United Nations, the largest supranational organization that we have, which is diplomatic in nature, looking to create diplomatic solutions throughout the world and to foster diplomacy between states throughout the world. ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, promoting economic integration and development in Southeast Asia, right? We think of those Asian tigers. This has a lot to do with that, right? These groups coming together to create economic plans for development. The African Union creating more integration and diplomatic relations between countries on the African continent to promote development socially and economically. All of these together, whether it's devolution, whether it's a supranational organization, right, within a country or between different countries, in a state, between different states, can challenge sovereignty because we're losing some bit of control in this case. And again, from territoriality to creating a nation state, that's what it's been about, having these specific geographic regions in which a government, a people can have sovereign control. And as the world has developed and globalized and things like that, we've seen that change, we've seen that become different. Um, and we've seen that evolve to change with the changing world. Probably the largest process that we see now, which is somewhat of a challenge to sovereignty, but more of a process that we see in the world today, is what we call neo-colonialism. So we've done away with, for the most part, the colonies and the colonial expansion of especially European powers, but especially not restricted to European powers. And we have this new neo-colonialism, right? Neo being new, colonialism being colonialism, right? New colonialism. And it's more about indirect control, right? It's not about having this direct colonial reach, but about having control or influence economically, politically, socially, etc. And so we see now, like here in our example with Africa, the African continent was ripe with resources. There were just a plethora of resources available, and that's part of the reason, the majority reason why we saw European powers right scramble for Africa in that Berlin conference, the conference of Berlin, in order to find ways to establish control over some of these resources. Now, the European powers have left. Countries, states in Africa are independent, but there's still this dependency, right? We're going back to Wallerstein now, on core countries, on former colonial powers, which are the majority of core countries, right? That's not a mistake. It's not a coincidence. Right? This is maybe not planned, but it is a direct result of this colonial expansion and colonial control. And so now we see things like trade partners being established, and we'll see that lots of these countries in Africa, especially, who were once under colonial rule, are still economic trade partners with their former colonial rulers to an extreme degree in some cases. We can see throughout Africa, we have petroleum, uranium, cotton. Majority of these processes and products, these exports, are in the primary sector. Primary economic activities that are exported to newly industrialized countries into the secondary sector for processing, and then exported to more developed countries in the core, in the tertiary sector for sale and distribution. These are not mistakes. This is that same cycle, right? The only difference here is the establishment of, right, a state. But these boundaries themselves, as we looked at, were superimposed to begin with, right? These were all European boundaries drawn in Africa, for the most part, right, around and overlapping cultural identities and boundaries that were already established prior to this massive colonial expansion in the 19th century. And we saw the same reasons for them coming over to collect and cultivate these resources and export them again out for industrial purposes to eventually sell them as finished goods or products. And that again hasn't changed. So there's this new neo-colonialism that's taking place that's established as a result of these colonial ties to the region, because these countries, while not under colonial rule, are still very much affected by old colonial ties, especially economically, because now the income of the country, or the GDP, and the economic growth of the country is tied to former colonial powers, or the MDCs. And we see this new process that's playing out in terms of state development, right? How these countries may develop over time, LDC, NIC to MDC, and whether or not that cycle will be broken, right? For Wallerstein, unless the core countries change, it's not going to happen. But this is one of these underlying causes. Because yes, we got the colonialism as it was out of the way, for the most part, but this echo of colonialism, as we might call it, right? This indirect control economically or politically, if we think about trade policies that may occur, is still in place. And so there is still this sort of control that's been established, and that is still tying these countries to old colonial powers. That closes off our political unit. Here's hoping it was helpful to you. Hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe. And we'll see you with reviews next week.